So welcome everyone. It is our pleasure today to host Tom Dietterich. Tom Dietterich is a distinguished professor emeritus in the School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at Oregon State University. He has worked on the field of machine learning and is an expert on robust AI, robust human AI systems, and applications in sustainability, and more recently also to anomaly detection. And he has received multiple awards. He also serves the community in many different ways. I will just briefly mention two recent awards, which are the ACML and AAAI Distinguished Service Awards. And today he will be talking about computer vision and anomaly detection. So with that, I will leave it to you, Tom. And yes, thank you again for being here today.
Okay, well, it's my pleasure to have this chance to talk to people and to give a more, I guess, historical view of this line of research that I've been pursuing. And most of the work today is a collaboration with a student of mine, Alex Geyer, who contributed several insights, and also want to thank my colleagues at Oregon State, Fuxin Li, Stefan Li, and Alan Fern. We have a robust AI research group, and they've provided lots of useful advice along the way. So let's see if I can get my keyboard focus on here. Okay, so the outline is I'm first going to talk about my first contact with what is known as the open set problem, which was in the context of an insect identification domain. And then I took a detour into anomaly detection in feature-based representations, mostly looking at security type applications. And out of that, I will give a brief sort of review of the four basic mechanisms for anomaly detection that have grown up in that space. But then, in the last 5 years, I've returned to thinking about the open set problem in computer vision. And so the part that's the not better part is really the surprise that these feature-based methods, when we tried to bring them into meaning the larger computer vision community, not just my group, find that they're not working particularly well. I mean, they're not terrible, but their performance has been disappointing. And that there's actually a very simple method, taking the max of the logits of a classifier is giving very good performance. And so then the final third of the talk will be trying to understand why, by looking at the representations, what's happening when we're learning the representations in deep learning, and get some insights into maybe why the max logit is working. So that's the plan, and I'll try to stop a couple of times in here to entertain questions. So let's get started. So my university is a leader internationally in ecology, and one of the things they like to do is measure the water quality in fresh water. And you can measure it chemically, of course, by taking a water sample, but a more reliable measure is actually to look at what insects are living in the water. So it turns out there are many species of so-called freshwater macroinvertebrates, right, which means big bugs, that spend most of their lives as larvae living underwater. So they have gills and they live underwater, and then a lot of them leave the water, develop wings, and fly around to mate with each other during the reproductive phase. But they spend most of their lives in the water, and different species are vulnerable to different kinds of pollution. So if you collect a sample of what's living in a stream and you identify each of the insects to at least the genus level and ideally to the species level, you can get a sort of histogram of how many of each species you have, and that gives you, you can turn that into a stream health index profile. And so my collaborators went out and collected 100 samples of each of 54 different taxonomic groups of insects that were of interest to the US Environmental Protection Agency. And in collaboration with, since I'm not really a computer vision person, right, I'm more of a machine learning person, but Linda Shapiro, who's been doing computer vision for her whole career, and her student Natalia Larios and some other folks, and I also had help from Sinisha Todorovich and let's see, I'm trying to remember, and Eric Mortensen, who are computer vision researchers at Oregon State. We published a series of papers in the late, around 2010 and so on, where we were able to achieve something like 90% accuracy on this 54 class problem. It's a fine-grained classification problem, and we were using pre-deep learning methods. So these were things like SIFT features and HOG features and various things like that. So the only problem is that there are many more than 54 species of insects out there. And what I didn't understand when I designed the project was that this picture here shows these two technicians out in a stream collecting a sample. And you sort of, it's just called a kick net. You kick the sort of mud, it's known as the substrate of the stream, into the net. And then you bring it into the lab and you extract the insects from the sample, and then you need to do the classification. And it turns out that in addition to the 54 taxa of interest, in the United States, there are actually 1,200 species that might show up in your trap. And when they told me this, it was like, oh no, I really didn't formulate the problem properly, because it's really a 1,200-way classification problem, not a 54-way classification problem. And it's even more if you consider we were trying to build an automated robotic apparatus that would separate out the specimens, photograph them, and then physically sort them based on the classification. So that would mean we would also have other kinds of things like bottle caps and other kinds of trash, small rocks, and we would need to deal with those too. And when we looked at our equal error rate in this novel class problem, it was about 20%. That is to say, 20% of the novel objects would be classified into one of the known classes, and 20% of the known class objects would be classified as being novel. And so it was really not usable for the task. That error rate was just too high. So we were never able to deploy this and actually make it work. Although there is a team in Finland that has had much more success now with deep learning and handling many more than 54 classes. But this is an instance of what is known in computer vision as the open set or the open category problem. The idea that we don't have a fixed set of categories that we're trying to classify, but in fact, the set is open and we will encounter objects that belong to new classes in our test data, even though they weren't present in the training data. And we need to detect that and sort of protect our classifier from those novel class objects. So in this case, it suffices for us to just say, oh, this thing does not belong to one of my known classes, so I can just reject it. So I can just treat this as a problem of classification with a reject option. But I want to do that rejection carefully. There are versions of the open category problem, sometimes called the open world problem, where I want to reject it and ask my biologist, so what do you call this thing? What is class 55? And he would give me some name for that. And then I would want to do few-shot learning and add that to my classifier. But that's not the problem here. It's just to say, this thing is something new, and I refuse to classify it because it doesn't belong to any of my known classes. Okay, well, at this point, our funding had ended after a series of grants, and I moved on to some new projects that all involved more security problems, either detecting insider threats in a company or detecting what are called advanced persistent threats in a computer network. And these were funded by DARPA, and the way they would set things up is that there would be a so-called red team. So we would have some training data well, actually, no, I shouldn't say that. What we would get is we would get data that would have, that would contain somewhere in there, unknown to us or not marked, not supervised, injected threats that were injected by a red team. and our job was to detect them. So I guess formally we would say we have a bunch of data. It's a mixture of nominal points and some contaminations. And the contaminations are the anomalies, and our goal is to detect the anomalies. And we have no supervised data at all, so it's not a classification problem. It's just an anomaly detection problem. So I was interested in this, inspired by the fact that we could think of the open set problem as really trying to decide whether this new image is anomalous compared to our training data. And so we could, if we had a deep anomaly detector, maybe that would solve the open category detection problem. So anyway, we worked with feature-based anomaly detection. And here, of course, we're doing a lot of feature engineering, trying to come up with dimensions that we believe will reveal anomalous behavior, and also trying to come up with features that will normalize away nominal behavior. So just as an example, one feature you might use is this person visiting a website that they have never visited before in an insider thread or in a computer network? Is the user invoking an application they've never invoked before? But this could be weird because maybe you want to create you've got a feature that is now relativized to a particular person. And that's very important because you know, if you have two different users in a company and one of them always has elevated privileges because they're a system administrator, that's normal behavior for a sysadmin, but that is not normal behavior for a professor, right? Or an undergraduate student or something. And so you do a lot of this kind of very clever feature engineering to try to make this anomaly detection work. And so here are the results. The evaluations were called Vegas for obscure reasons, but I just want to, these were our scores, our area under the ROC scores. And you can see that the Oregon State University team was #1 in the June evaluation. And we were using something called the isolation forest or a Gaussian mixture model. So we'll talk about these in a moment. And we also were #1 in July, again, with isolation forest and some other methods. And so those are very nice results. And in our advanced persistent threats area, we were also doing very well. Here we were taking advantage of the fact that when we have a big problem in anomaly detection is that you typically have false alarms. In fact, many false alarms. And often anomaly detection solutions are rejected in industry because of this false alarm rates become just intolerable. So one of the things we wanted to do was in security applications, typically you get an alarm, you show it to an analyst, and they can tell you, give you feedback. No, this is a false alarm, or, oh yes, this looks interesting. I'm going to open a trouble ticket on this and we're going to investigate this one. So we would use that feedback. And in particular, my colleague Alan Fern and his graduate student Amran Siddiqui developed a technique that was based on taking the isolation forest algorithm that, again, I'll describe in a moment, and modifying it to update it using online mirror descent, which is one of these online convex optimization algorithms that is just a very quick learning algorithm. And so what I'm showing here is the number of false alarms we needed to present to the analyst before we successfully found the first of these cyber attacks. And the sort of reddish bars are with if you just fit the anomaly detector to the data and then try to use it. And the blue bars are if we can incorporate feedback from the analyst. And so we can see here that instead of 40 plus false alarms, we could just have about 3 false alarms before we had a successful detection. And on host #2, instead of 60 false alarms, we could get it down to about 10. Host 3 was more difficult for us. We only got maybe a 50% speed up. But we were very happy with these results too. So big successes for anomaly detection with featureized data. Actually, this would maybe be the first place to stop if anybody has any questions about this work. This is still more kind of the historical background to our frustrations.
maybe one question, and while I say it out loud, like I remind to others to also type it on the chat, or if you wish to ask something. I mean, maybe this is a nice question, but when I did my PhD many years ago, I was working on Bayesian parametrics, and I was wondering if this has been applied. Seems like the natural applications for the open category classification problem, right? Like you don't know the number of classes in advance.
Right? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there is any line of work along this direction or not. Or successful line of work.
I don't know. I mean, I think there has been work. Some people have created another sort of benchmarking or formal problem description for something that's called category discovery. Also, there's another formulation called rare category discovery. And so the idea is that I give you initially unlabeled data, and you do some kind of cluster analysis, perhaps based on non-parametric cluster analysis, and then you can present a data point. You can ask an expert to label this data point and say, does this belong to a new class? And if so, what do you call this thing? And then you apply that label to that entire cluster. And then you say, okay, now I found that class. Now I don't want to, my goal is to find another class, and you want to discover as many classes as possible. For instance, in astronomy, this is used. And so there was work at CMU over the years, and my colleague Wen-Qin Wang, who did his PhD at CMU and then has continued to work on these kinds of problems at Oregon State. And I know that Abhinav, I think Srinivasan at University of Maryland has been proposing a benchmark for category discovery in computer vision, which would be a similar kind of problem. Right, so it's not enough just to detect, you need to now discover novel categories. Yeah, of course, the thing with Bayesian nonparametrics, usually it doesn't just converge in distribution, but usually over segments, it learns too many clusters.
Yeah, I mean, that might happen. Yeah, there are normally spurious clusters that appear and disappear as you run the inference method. So, right. I mean, thinking in a sampling-based kind of approach. Yeah, that could happen.
Well,
that could happen.
Yeah. Good question.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I will move on here. So the out of this literature, and there have been many big review papers, including one that I participated in that came out last year in proceedings of the IEEE, that was led by Lucas Ruff from Technical University of Berlin. We can divide these techniques into sort of 4 general classes. So let me describe those. So the first are distance-based methods, right? So if you have well-designed features, then an anomaly can be found just by looking at, say, its minimum distance to a nearest neighbor, or the 3 nearest neighbors, something like this. So if you have a good distance metric, this works, and an outlier, basically we're assuming that outliers is a good indicator of being novel or anomalous. And these are actually dots from Fisher's iris data. So these are I chose 2 of the classes to be known or nominal. And this is from a new class, a 3rd class, and we can see it's quite far away. It requires a good distance metric, but if you're engineering the features, you can usually engineer the distance metric too. And an instance, this algorithm that I keep mentioning, the isolation forest, was developed by Liu Ting and Zhou back in 2011, and it was proved in 2016 by Guha et al. That it's basically a distance-based method that approximates the L1 distance between a query and the training data. And what it does is it basically grows fully random binary trees, somewhat like a decision tree. So it chooses one attribute of the data. I index my attributes by J. So it chooses attribute J at random among the attributes. And then it looks at the range of observed values for that attribute and chooses a threshold uniformly at random in that range. And then we're going to split the data according to that threshold and do this recursively. Again, at each level, randomly choosing a feature, randomly choosing a threshold within the range of the data points that reach that node. And we do this in a very aggressive way until we have fully isolated every data point in its own leaf all by itself. Of course, if there are ties or identical data points, then they'll be together in a leaf. And so this seems like radical overfitting of the data, right? But the idea, the quantity of interest is actually the number of random splits that it took to isolate this data point. And that's known as the isolation depth. And in this case, that depth is 3. And so you can kind of get a feeling why this might be related to the Manhattan distance, because we're doing distances, in some sense, distances along the dimensions. You don't, of course, any one tree is not very informative, but if you grow an ensemble of 50 or 100 or 1,000 of these and calculate the average isolation depth, then this team had a very clever way of normalizing those to get a score between 0 and 1, where the larger scores are good anomaly scores. And so the second approach is density estimation. And so I think this is the first thing that any one of the people in machine learning think about is, well, we've all studied information theory, and we know that Shannon tells us that the negative log probability is the surprisal. And it's so a very elegant idea, right? That if we have an event of probability 0, then this is infinitely surprising, because the log of 0 is negative infinity, and we negate that. And if we have an event with probability 1, it has 0 surprisal. And so this is just a beautiful thing. But now thinking of it from, of course, here we're fitting a density, not a probability. So the densities could be bigger than 1. So maybe the story isn't quite right. But certainly low densities will get high anomaly scores. And so you might ask, well, why use densities rather than just distances? And I think aside from the of the data, right? Because basically every data point contributes to the density estimate at any location. And so obviously this would assign a very high anomaly score to this query point here, but maybe a much lower. This is an algorithm called LODA that came from Pevney. Of course, density estimation in high dimensions is a very hard problem, at least if you're doing it non-parametrically. But one thing you can do is to take what Pevney does is builds an ensemble of sparse low-dimensional projections of the data. In particular, sparse projections down to 1 dimension. And so just simply here, I just projected onto the vertical axis here, which is the petal length in the iris problem. And then you can calculate a kernel density estimator. That's very easy. And then you can score the densities here and here. And again, any one low dimensional projection is bad, but if you build 100 or 1,000 of them and use the average of the surprisals, this is a pretty good anomaly score. The third approach, basically following Vatnik's principle, right, which says that, you're going to an awful lot of work to build a density estimator and then just threshold it to declare an anomaly. Why don't we just try to fit some quantile of the density? Let's just learn that boundary, and then everything outside the boundary will declare to be an anomaly. And that's the idea behind the one-class support vector machine, right? Or the support vector data description is that we're going to learn a decision boundary that contains, say, 1 minus epsilon of the training data, and we'll label everything outside the boundary as an anomaly. Now, an issue, I think, in practice is it's kind of hard to choose epsilon at training time. In real applications, again, because of the false alarm problems, the user will often want to adjust the threshold to get the number of alarms down to something they can handle. So that's a drawback of quantile methods, but again, these have been very popular. And then the final approach is reconstruction methods. And the first time I saw these was in the work of Dean Pomerleau, who was a PhD student at CMU back in 1992, and working on self-driving or at least self-steering vehicles. So they had this system called the Nav Lab, which was a big van. It had a forward-looking camera that gave you a 30 by 32 pixel image. And then he fed that into a multi-layer perceptron, which had 4 hidden units in a single hidden layer, and then 30 output units that encoded the steering command, because this was really just a self-steering vehicle, and it was trained by imitation learning. So they just drove it around and recorded the steering angle of the human expert, so to speak, and trained it. But then Pomerleau added what we would now say he would add a autoencoder head as a second head on the network. And so the idea was that given this input image, it should try to reproduce the same input as output, right? And then we could measure if we're given a new query image XQ, we call this XQ hat as our reconstructed image. And if there's a large reconstruction error, that suggests that we shouldn't trust these hidden units, because evidently we're showing it an image that it cannot reconstruct. And so I call this principle anomaly detection through failure. You try to define a task where the learned system should fail when it's given an out of distribution input, a query. And this worked quite well for Pomerleau. Okay, so my student Andrew Emmett did a master's with me, and he did a series of benchmarking studies comparing just the first 3 kinds, the distance-based, density-based, and quantile-based methods on a large set of benchmark data sets that we constructed by repurposing classification data sets from the UC Irvine repository. So we would choose some set of the classes to be the anomalies and the remaining classes to be the nominals, the known classes. But we threw away the class labels and we just created a data set that had some fraction of anomalies in it. In fact, we called that the relative frequency, what fraction of the data was anomalous. And we also manipulated that, and we manipulated the point difficulty, that is how deeply buried the anomalies were inside the nominal data. We would manipulate the amount of irrelevant features to challenge the anomaly detectors. And because these distance-based and density-based methods are vulnerable to tight clusters of anomalies, we tried to choose how clustered the anomalies were. And then we ended up with roughly 12,000 non-trivial benchmark data sets. And so we'd run all of these algorithms on all of these data sets and then collect up the results. And we would measure the area under the ROC curve for this binary decision. Is it an anomaly or is it a nominal data point? And then what we wanted to do was do an analysis of variance. Basically, we can treat the area under the ROC curve as a probability, right? It is the probability that if you give it a random anomaly point and a random known point, what's the probability that it will give a higher anomaly score to the anomaly? So it's a ranking metric in a sense. And so the log odds of that can be treated like a logistic regression. And so we can fit a linear model where we have predictor variables for the relative frequency, the point difficulty, and so on. P set is the parent data set, the domain, and finally, the algorithm that we're using. And we wanted to know, basically, if you control for all these other sources of difficulty, what is the effect of the algorithm on the area under the ROC curve? I mean, not surprisingly, the domain has the most impact, and then the relative frequency is very important, and the algorithm choice was actually the third most important factor. But as a machine learning person, we're interested in the algorithm. And so here were the effects of the choice of algorithm on the area under the ROC curve. And what we found was that the distance-based metrics, like the k-nearest neighbor and the isolation forest, were the top scorers. And then there were a couple of density-based methods that came in sort of second place. There's kind of a tie here. Some more distance-based methods. Here's another density method. And the decision boundary method, the quantile methods, were the worst performers. And so based on this, I really fell in love with the isolation forest. And we think these score poorly because they're not trained to do ranking. They're just trained to learn that decision boundary. And so it turns out if you evaluate them on a ranking metric, hey, they don't score so well. That's maybe not a surprise. Okay, so again, maybe I'll stop for questions here and see if there are any that people want to ask.
I can't see anything in the chat, but if anyone has a question, just feel free to unmute yourself. I mean, I have questions, but I think it might be a
we'll
discussion, so I will leave it up for the end. Yeah.
Okay, so all of this preliminary is just to say that we had very positive experiences using the isolation forest or nearest neighbor methods, density methods in the feature vector space. Yeah, go ahead.
One good question in the chat by Mehdi. It says KNN is doing better than isolation forest, so why choosing isolation forest? Yeah.
Well, the trouble with the KNN, of course, is you have to keep your data around, and making the k-nearest neighbor algorithm efficient takes quite a lot of tricks. Although I guess now there are some pretty good libraries for it. But the isolation forest, scales beautifully with the data and only takes log time to evaluate. So it takes a lot less memory to store an ensemble of isolation trees. So it's just much more practical from an implementation standpoint. But we will try nearest neighbor in a moment. We will give it a try. Another question.
Okay, so that might answer the next question, right, John? Which says, in addition to that, any insights of why KNN is doing better?
Why do I think it's doing better? Well, I mean, I think on this one, maybe, fundamentally distances are very informative, especially with well-engineered features. The isolation forest is only approximately a distance method, whereas KNN is exactly a distance method. So maybe that's why it's doing better. But I should say, for these problems, because we were repurposing classification problems, the features were engineered to deliberately try to make the classes discriminatable, right? Which means that they are very good for also separating the anomalies from the nominals. So it could be that when we move to computer vision or even these adversarial problems like the cyber attacks and so on, I was surprised that we still saw good performance, right? Because in there the features were maybe not so carefully designed, and yeah. So okay, well, so I came back to computer vision after the deep learning revolution. First working on some problems in detecting novel types of obstacles for self-taxiing aircraft. So this is sort of the self-driving airplane when it's on the ground, and collaborating with Boeing. And also doing experiments on things like CFAR 10 and CFAR 100 data sets. So what we would do here is hold out some of the categories to be novel classes, and then see if we could train a classifier to discriminate among the known classes, but also then extract some kind of an anomaly score that we could use to detect when we were being shown an image that belonged to one of the novel classes. So, my intuitions were based on thinking about this probabilistically, right? The joint distribution of the data is, P of X being the image and Y being the class label. And we know in discriminative learning, we are just learning the conditional distribution, P of Y given X. But my intuition is that in anomaly detection, we really should be modeling P of X and then looking for, small values of P of X when we get a query. Again, this is thinking very much in Shannon's appraisal kind of mindset. Of course, with images, P of X would be in pixel space, and we really trying to estimate probability distributions in pixel space is very challenging. And so, of course, the natural response in deep learning is, well, let's learn a latent representation. So given X, let's think of training like a convolutional neural network to be our encoder that will encode our image in some latent representation, and then we could model P of Z. So this was the way I was thinking that we would approach anomaly detection if we were using densities, or maybe using distances in the Z space would be good, right? So just to fix some notation then, right, we'll call the input image X, and then we'll treat the whole backbone of a convolutional neural network or a vision transformer or what have you as an encoder that encodes that in some as a vector of features. In this case, this was based on a standard CNN with a latent space with 1024 dimensions. And then we have this fully connected layer, which basically computes so-called logits, right? And the logit is a learned weight vector for class K, and take the dot product of that with this Z vector here. And that gives us a score, right, where larger scores should be higher. And we actually can make the classification decision just by taking the maximum of these logit scores. But we usually convert it to probabilities by using the softmax function, right? So we exponentiate each of these logits and divide by their sum. And this has the nice property of taking the logits, which may be real valued, and turning them into positive values and normalizing them to sum to 1 so that they are, at least syntactically, they're probabilities. But also this is the link function for the multinomial or discrete distribution. So it's a very sensible thing to do. Okay, so that's the notation. So another one of my students, Rishit Garapalli, in his master's thesis, compared a bunch of different techniques, different signals that you could extract from a trained classifier. So we could, for instance, one thing we could do is we could apply the isolation forest to these Z vectors, or LOF, which is local outlier factor, is a kind of normalized nearest neighbor method. Or we could take, for instance, the entropy of the predicted probabilities, the intuition being here, if the classifier is very uncertain and outputs something close to the uniform distribution, that will be a very high entropy and it will be a sign of anomalousness. We could take the max of the softmax probabilities. So, Dan Hendricks, when he was an undergraduate, published a paper showing that the maximum of the softmax probabilities, when it is small, is an indicator, obviously, that the classifier is not very confident. And so, so maybe that would be a good anomaly score. If we train using a one versus all classifiers and use the binary cross entropy, we can use that instead. Or we could just use the logit value itself. And the maximum of the logit scores, again, if it is small, that indicates a lack of confidence of the classifier. And so what he found was that the maximum of the logit scores actually gave us the best area under the ROC curve. I think this is for a case where we're treating maybe 90 classes as known and 10 classes held out as novel. And disappointingly, the isolation forest and this nearest neighbor method perform very badly, right? I mean, these are AUCs that are worse than random, or basically at random. So very depressing. So this was where I was really surprised at how poorly these methods performed, because the logit scores, none of these are modeling P of X. They're all looking at P of Y given X. So they're doing the wrong thing from a theoretical standpoint. Well, we weren't the only people to notice this. And in fact, there's this beautiful paper that came out of Andrew Zisserman's group at Oxford back in October, of last year. And then I think appeared maybe at ICLIER this year, called Open Set Recognition, a good classifier is all you need. And they basically said, well, if we train, convolutional neural network, of course, they're using VGG because that's their group. And you just train them on standard cross entropy with all the latest tricks. So cosine learning rate schedules with warm up, using rand augmentations, and doing label smoothing. Then the maximum of the logit scores was giving the best area under the ROC curve on some problems that they were looking at. And in particular, they did some standard things where you train on, I can't remember what they train on as their in distribution data. and then test on where they treat the anomalies as data that come from other data sets. So maybe in distribution was something like, well, I don't remember now. But what they showed was whereas people had been publishing papers comparing against basic cross-entropy implementation, but if you do what they call cross-entropy plus, which was all of these tricks, and compare against state-of-the-art techniques like something called open hybrid that fits a density model to the Z's, or this thing called adversarial reciprocal points, which is a very clever technique. Basically, you can match the performance just using the maximum of the logit scores of a really well-trained state-of-the-art classifier. And this is all using a protocol developed by one of our students at Oregon State, Lawrence Neal, not to be confused with Neil Lawrence. It's very, okay, and they also put together, Vase et al. Put together some additional benchmarks using the bird data and the fine-grained visual classification with aircraft, and then ImageNet, where you train an ImageNet 1K and then evaluate your anomalies or out of distribution data are coming from some of the other ImageNet classes. And again, they were typically getting higher area under the ROC curve using cross-entropy plus than this adversarial reciprocal points technique, except on the ImageNet data where ARPL plus is doing well. So this is great. Why is the max logit score working so well? What's going on? Well, we decided, Alex and I, to look at the representations that were being learned, because we thinking about it abstractly in terms of distances or probabilities just wasn't giving us insight. And so Alex trained, so we just wanted to visualize what's happening during the learning process. So Alex trained a DenseNet, which has only a 384 dimensional latent space on CFAR10 data with 6 known classes and 4 novel classes. And what you'll see is these light green points are the novel class data, and the darker green points are going to be from these 6 known classes. And we collected the Z vectors after every epoch, and then took all of the Z vectors from all the epochs and threw them into UMAP, which is a visualization tool similar to t-SNE, but scales much better. And so here's what happens. This is the starting configuration. And then as we start training, what we see is that the data from the known classes is kind of pulled out from the center of the space and forms up into these kind of bubbles. And then the bubbles collapse to form nice tight clusters for the known classes. But the light green points that all belong to the novel classes, which of course are not in the training data, so the classifier isn't seeing them, they kind of occupy this space in the middle of the representations. They have not, well, some of the points have been pulled out. There's a few of them that have been pulled away, but an awful lot of them are still close to the origin. And so the naive mental model that the novel data are going to be outliers doesn't really hold. They're sort of super inliers here. Now, it might still work that if you build a density model here, for instance, there's a technique called the Mahalanobis method where you fit multivariate Gaussians to the known class clusters with a shared covariance matrix, and then you measure your distance in Mahalanobis distance to the nearest cluster center, and that might work it works reasonably well. We'll see in a moment some results from that. But other groups have found similar things. So there was a paper by Tack et al. Where they were using SimClear, which is a fully self-supervised method. And they found on in-distribution data from CFAR10 that the SimClear vectors had much bigger distribution and larger norm than out-of-distribution data. And Vase et al. Has found the same thing. This is, again, CFAR10 with 6 classes. The data points are much farther away from the origin, whereas the 4 novel classes are all clustered close to the origin. So this led Alex and I to come up with something we call the familiarity hypothesis. And the hypothesis is that these networks are not actually detecting novelty. They're detecting the absence of familiarity. So if we think about what a convolutional neural network is learning, it's learning some sort of feature detectors that detect image patches that are relevant to the classification task. And then the logit is weighting those features to make the classification decision. And the hypothesis is that objects that belong to novel classes just activate fewer features because fewer of these learned patches are present in the image. And so, for example, if we had never seen an elephant before, according to the familiarity hypothesis, the only things that might be activated might be detectors for feet, for legs, maybe for eyes. And it would say, well, gee, I just don't see very many familiar features here, so my logits are going to be small. And so it's not saying this elephant is novel because, oh my goodness, it has a trunk and it has tusks and it has these big ears. I've never seen anything like that before. Precisely, that's the problem. The network has never seen anything like that before. It does not have feature detectors that can detect those things. So it has no representation for them. So that's the fundamental, this hypothesis that we are now exploring. So I realize I'm already running out of time. So I'll present a little bit of the evidence for this. So one of the things we see is that if we look at the number of features that have strong activations for in-domain known classes of objects, the number of features that have an activation above 1 is about 10 versus it's about 6 for things that are out of distribution. Or if you look at features that are activated at a level 2 or above, similar, the in-domain features turn on about 4 of them, the out-of-domain maybe 1 or 2 of them. And we did some additional work to ask, well, are the features that have the lower activations, are they features that are actually on the objects of interest? And so to do this, we used Pascal VOC data where there were hand-drawn segmentation data available. And what we would do is blur the image and then use the segmentation mask to create a composite image where the object of interest is blurred, but the background is intact. And then we would say any feature whose activation changed when we blurred the image must be a feature that, at least in part, is measuring this part of the image, the part that was blurred. Whereas a feature that is invariant must be only looking at the background. And so here are some examples of the original images and their blurred versions. And this doesn't detect all object-related features because obviously the outline of the object is still very clearly, crisply present in the image. So if there are shape features, they might be measuring something about the object, but it's unaffected by the blurring. So, but any feature that is damaged or whose activation changes when we blur the object must be measuring something about the object. So then we can look at features whose activation decreases when you blur them. And we call those presence features. They're measuring some pattern that should be present in the image. And when you blur it, the activation goes down. But there are also absence features that when you blur the image, their activation actually increases. So they are signaling that some pattern has been removed from the image by giving a high activation. So we call those absence features. And so we can get an on-object score by looking at the average change in the activation of a feature for a particular class. So OO of JK is the on-object score for a feature on a class. And we can also look at what weight does the logit vector put on it. So we end up with a 4-way classification of features as to whether they are presence features that are assigned a positive weight by the classifier, which means that for class K, it wants to see that feature present. Or if it's an absence feature, it might put a negative weight on it, since it wants to see that feature being the absence. And then there also, you can have positive absence and negative absence features as well. And so then we can develop a thing, and in the interest of time, let me skip ahead to this picture here. So what we're doing actually is we're sorting all the features according to for a particular class. This is class 3, sorting all the features by their average contribution to the logit score. So the weight assigned to that feature times its average activation. And so there's a blue line here that is the mean activation. And then the dots are when we blur the image, what happens. And so the key thing we can see here, if we look, it's kind of hard to see this for this whole 2048 features, but if we zoom in on just the tails, over here we can see this is the average contribution of each of these features here to the logit score. And when we blur the image, mostly those contributions drop. And that's because these all are assigned positive weights by the classifier, and if they're red, that means they're a presence feature. So these are features that need to be present to be classified as class 3, and when we blur them, their activation drops. And here are features that should be absent in order to classify as class 3, and when we blur them, their activation increases, but they're assigned a negative weight. So that also causes the logit score to drop. So both on the positive presence and negative absence features, when you're given a novel object or a blurred object, the activations drop. And so if we go and look at actual novel objects, this is the picture we see, that on this novel object, the activations of the presence features all drop, and the activations of the negative absence features all drop. So the logit score is decreased. So we view this as kind of a smoking gun for the familiarity hypothesis, because it's really seeing, here are all these features that are familiar to me, and I want them to be present for class, whatever this is, class 3 or something. And when they're absent, when they drop, then I assign it a lower logit score. And we see the same thing with other images. And we can summarize that by adding up all of the contributions of these positive presence features, and the same for each of the 3 other kinds. And now sorting them by their max logit scores, this is the effect of those positive presence features is the main thing that we see. And if we compare that to the accuracy of the anomaly detection, we see that this is these track each other really well. That the decrease in activation of these positive presence features basically explains the anomaly score. Okay, so it looks like I have a bunch of questions here. So let me just briefly talk about the implications, though. So if familiarity-based novelty detection is working well and giving good AUC scores, should we be happy? I think there's the fundamental problem listed here at the bottom is that the network is not detecting the aspects of the image that would cause a human to label it as novel, right? It's not seeing the tusks, it's not seeing the trunks, it's just seeing very few things that it recognizes. So from a causal standpoint, we're not really identifying the cause of novelty. We're really measuring kind of a side effect of the novelty. And evidence of failures there will be, well, if an object is occluded, or large parts of it are occluded, it's also going to get a lower logit score, and we would have a false alarm as a novelty detector. Or if we have an image that contains both a known object and a novel object, the known object is going to turn on all of the familiar features, and so we won't notice the novel object. And we haven't verified this, but it's pretty likely that adversarial attacks could raise the activations of familiar features so that a novel object would escape being detected, or could take a known object and somehow push down the activations of familiar features to cause it to be a false alarm. So I think these are the risks of familiarity-based novelty detection. So yeah, so maybe I'll answer questions here.
Actually, I think, well, I have a small question about the max logit score. So okay. I understand what's the reasoning behind it, because the logits, if I understand correctly, unless they're not normalized, they can be anything. They're the
unnormalized probabilities, yeah, in some sense.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So what does the max logit tell you exactly? Like you can shift everything, and yeah.
Right. Well, yeah, it turns out probably because we initialize the weights near 0, and also because we have some weight decay when we train these networks, that the logits are generally if you add up the average value of the logit scores averaged across the classes is almost always very close to 0. So the logits are actually centered around 0. So to make a logit, so it's you usually think of that we need to normalize the logits by their sum or their exponentiated sum to get them to be normalized. But in fact, they're already pretty well normalized, it turns out.
Okay.
So yeah, so the key thing, of course, is the gap between them. And obviously we could add a constant to all the logits and we'd still get the same probabilities out. So the logits do have an extra degree of freedom, but I think empirically they don't really use that very much. So it's really just a sum of the evidence for and against that class, right? So it seems, so why is it's slightly better than using the maximum softmax probability as the indicator? Maybe because the normalization slightly loses some information, but
yeah, that's slightly surprising to me. But yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Yes. Okay. So I think Melanie has questions as well. Melanie.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom, for the great talk. So I have 2 questions. The first one is regarding the method. So it seems that the reconstruction method is fundamentally different from the KNN density or quantile, in the sense that it's specific for a downstream application. And so it's not generic anomaly, but it's like what is weird with respect to this downstream task. Isn't that the case?
Well, reconstruction, if you could make it work, I think is beautiful also, because as you say, the parts of the image that you cannot reconstruct might be the novel parts. And so there is work I know that's been done in medical imaging where they've been able to use reconstruction techniques. But we've had a lot of trouble training autoencoders or variational autoencoders to fail on the auto distribution data. The trouble with deep nets is that they're too good, and even if you introduce a pretty tight bottleneck in the latent representation, they learn a general image compression algorithm. So when they're given novel images, they're able to reconstruct those very well too, because they've learned some really great sort of dictionary of for representing the compressed image and then decompressing it. So we've tried to fight that by using decoders that are quite limited in their representational power, but we found it just very tricky to control the autoencoders so that they fail out of distribution. It's just very hard.
Got you. And I guess the second question is, yeah, in the context of VAEs, so if you use anomaly detection methods in the latent space, how well can you say when the model doesn't know? Like, can you actually, I mean, that's I guess a very tough question.
Right. I don't think I have anything intelligent to say there. I know Rashik did some experiments with looking at the latent space, but I don't have anything useful to say, I guess. Yeah, it does seem like there might be an opportunity there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Well, we have a bunch of questions. Pulami, would you like to ask live? Unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks for this very nice presentation. My question is regarding the contrastive learning, where we said that we wanted to contrast, like we wanted to cluster the like objects together, and then the OOD samples should fall apart. So I have been working on this for the past year, and my aim was, of course, the other way around. I was thinking that the OOD samples should be lying far away, but this was not the case. And in the end, we concluded that it could be a whole cluster of distribution samples, and OOD samples are just in between. So now it was really, like intuitive to say that, okay, they are like falling in and the known samples are going out. But like, what is a good way for the distance metrics to say that this is the point where the known samples are like, this is the distance where the known samples are lying, or how do we arrive at that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we're seeing, if we go back to this distribution here, right, is at least with CNNs when we train them, the logits, an awful lot of the weights are very near 0 for an individual class. So we can think of each class as kind of defining its own distance metric, where it's paying attention only to the stuff that's happening up here and down here. And so each class chooses its own way of looking at the data. And I think that's one of the things that has defeated standard distance-based metrics is it's hard to come up with a class-independent metric that would work well. But I also have and that's, it's kind of beautiful actually, because if you have a class, for instance, that is a combination of familiar features, but from two different known classes, like, I don't know, a centaur, if we'd seen people and we'd seen horses, and now we see a centaur, which is a horse-human hybrid. If we just looked at the features that are activated and a distance in the z-space, it might look familiar. But for the horse classifier, there would be some features missing. And for the people classifier, there would also be some familiar features missing, maybe. And so it might be able to recognize that it's novel, even though it's a novel combination of known features. Yeah, I don't know, that there's maybe too much of a human. They're not human feet, so maybe human feet would be missing. I want to show you one other thing we have, though, because I didn't really have time to show it here, but we've recently done experiments with, again, instance contrastive learning and with a vision transformer. And with contrastive learning, it turns out these negative presence features are playing a significant role. So it behaves quite a bit differently. Whereas with the vision transformer, it's behaving similarly to what we saw with the convolutional network. And part of what seems to be going on is when we look at these diagrams for feature activations with that come out of self-supervised learning, the weights are non-zero almost everywhere, and the activations are non-zero almost everywhere. So there are many more negative weights and many more positive weights. It's just a dramatically different hidden representation than when it's like a CNN that's been trained with supervised training, or even with the vision transformer trained with supervised learning. You have much more the behavior that we saw with the CNN, where a lot more of the logit weights are close to zero. So I'm really intrigued to dig deeper into what's happening with self-supervised learning. It could be that that all these activations are really noise and make it harder for the max logit score to work well. I don't know, but it's really, they're just qualitatively very different. So
yeah, thanks a lot for
sure.
Those are really nice insights.
Cool. Another question from Daniel. What about adding one unknown output category with a fixed logit, say 0? How would this compare to setting a threshold on the max logit?
I mean, how would I, with a fixed score? I think that would that really do anything at all? I mean,
I guess the question is like a new category which is unknown, and that has,
right. And if you had training data for that, then so if you were doing something like outlier exposure, right? I mean, Dan Hendricks and I had that paper at Outlier Exposure, right, where we got a bunch of unlabeled data that we know is out of distribution, and we just tried to train the classifier to output the uniform distribution when it was given those. But other people have found that adding a K+1 class, a kitchen sink class, and trying to get it to assign a high logit score to all of those tends to work better. And we found furthermore that if you have auxiliary labeled training data, that for other classes that you don't care about at all, including those in the training process, helps tighten up the logit, the feature representations for the known classes. So I think I have a slide here somewhere on that. No, maybe not. Yes, here. So we did an experiment with CFAR 100 where we used 10 classes as known, 10 classes as novel, and 80 classes as auxiliary, that we don't really care about them. But we train on the known and auxiliary, so we have a 90-way classification problem. And then we test by just scoring the logits that correspond to the 10 known classes. And our AUC goes from 0.76 to 0.89, right? So it made a real big improvement in our anomaly detection AUC. It actually also just makes the 10-way classifier more accurate. So I think this is an interesting alternative to to fine-tuning a pre-trained network is, instead of fine-tuning an ImageNet trained network, retrain ImageNet with all of its 1,000 classes plus the classes that you care about, and then just ignore those auxiliary classes when you're doing the scoring. And I think you'll get much better results than if you pre-trained, try to fine-tune the pre-trained network.
Thank you.
Well, maybe I should, yeah, okay, yeah. Go ahead.
No, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to, I have one little wrap-up story at the end, but let's answer more questions first.
I think it's a good idea, like you go to wrap up and then we close with questions,
so,
if you have time, of course.
Yeah, so what I guess the fundamental question for me is it reasonable to expect computer vision systems to perceive things that they have not been trained on? And I was reminded of this experiment that we sometimes teach when we teach computer vision that was done back in the late 1960s by Blakemore and Cooper. And what they did was they raised kittens in an environment, most of the hours of the day, the kittens were kept in the dark, but for I think 4 hours of the day, kittens were raised in this constrained environment where all they saw, one group of kittens was raised in an all vertical stripe environment. And they even had a collar so they couldn't see their own body. And so they would just see these vertical stripes. They're on a transparent floor in this container. So the stripes, even they're standing on stripes. So vertical stripes. And then there were horizontal kittens where they were raised on the horizontal stripes. And what they found was that after being raised in this environment for, I think, 5 months, while their vision systems matured, when they were taken out of this and then placed in environments with a mix of contours, they were virtually blind to the contours that were perpendicular to the orientation that they had experienced when they were trained. So for example, if you had a vertical kitten and a horizontal kitten and you put them next to each other and you took a black stick and you held it vertically and wiggled it around, the vertical kitten would start playing with the stick, jump at it and follow it around, and the horizontal kitten would ignore it completely. But if you then tilted the stick so it was now horizontal, now the horizontal kitten would play with the stick and the vertical kitten would ignore it completely. So what I think that our deep networks are having this phenomenon, of course, not in such a simple way, but they've learned to recognize things in that where there was variation in the training set. They've learned features to account for that variation. In the case of supervised learning, variation that mattered for classification. In the case of self-supervised learning, variation that mattered for the augmentations that they needed to be invariant to. And so maybe it's just we should not expect our computer vision systems to be able to detect trunks or tusks if they've never seen them before. And so that, I guess, is the challenge I wanted to raise to the computer vision community and the deep learning community is there any way we could escape this and learn a set of features that maybe even though they were invariant in the training data, they might still be useful for detecting novelty. I don't know, maybe a little bit like our immune system learns to recognize things that it's never seen just by a kind of evolutionary diversification process. Maybe that's an analogy that might work. Okay, so I guess that's that. So the summary is, the max logit score works very well, and but it works because it's detecting the absence of familiar patterns rather than the presence of novelty. And this probably applies to all other deep novelty detection methods, probably share the same weakness. And I think building better models on top of familiarity-based features, like trying to do Bayesian techniques, is not going to help because it doesn't really address the problem that you just don't have a representation for novelty. So being Bayesian about it or building an ensemble isn't going to help. Because the fundamental problem is we need to learn better representations. So I'll stop there. I guess if you're interested in reading more, we have an archive paper here, and which we just revised recently. So it matches the talk you just saw.
It was a fantastic talk. Thank you very much. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. There are a couple of questions in the chat, and I also have a question by myself. I don't know if you have like a few more minutes or.
Sure, no problem.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. So the question by John in the chat is it possible that the anomalies clustering at the center might be phenomenon of the actual data itself, since most examples are on images?
No, I don't think so, because I mean, if we train on all 10 classes, they would all separate nicely. So it's more that the classifier just hasn't learned to. It doesn't have features that represent those held out classes, and so it wasn't forced to learn to tell them apart. I mean, this particularly applies for the supervised case, but even in the self-supervised case, we saw that that it hasn't learned features that really pull the novel classes away from the known classes.
Makes sense. There's another question by John as well. Is there any observation regarding the presence of features for particular labels coinciding with another label? For instance, we would expect some of the features showing up for the class dog to also show up for the class cat. Yes.
Yes. Yes. Right. Yes. And I think and that's probably what's going on in this self-supervised case, right? I mean, the Logit score for those features may be close to 0, right? Because if a feature is not useful for discrimination, then it may get a very low weight, at least for the dog versus cat case. If there are features that are unique to cats, then the dog classifier can put a negative weight on them, right, to discriminate from those. So that's why when I was measuring all those contributions, it was respect to a particular class. I'm not sure if I answered the question.
I think so. I think that's a fair answer. And yeah, just a final question to wrap up. I would like to hear your thoughts. I don't know if you're familiar with. There was a paper that was submitted last year to our workshop, actually, to I Can Believe It's Not Better, about density-based outlier detection. And actually, it's now published in the journal Entropy. And it's like, I think the key idea of the paper is that once you change the X, essentially the distribution of X,
right?
The densities, of course, varies as you change the parameterization of the data. So in particular, you can always find a transformation, a bijective transformation that makes the density on X uniform, in which case that any density-based method will not do much. And yeah, what do you think of this, and how can we prevent this issue?
Yeah, so I like that paper very much. This was the one that said, basically deep density estimation is not going to give you good anomaly scores, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And there have been some other papers pointing out that that these deep density estimators are not doing a very good job of representing the tails of the distribution. And that's of course, it's kind of exactly, I mean, they're trained to do well on the typical set of the distribution, not to do well on the tails. The lesson I take away from that is representation matters. And when you do these arbitrary reversible invertible transformations, you're damaging the distances between things, and so you're damaging the representation. And so that's my interpretation of what's going on. And as they point out, if you do the transformation to get the uniform distribution over the unit interval or something like this, now there are no tails at all to the distribution. So what are those deep density estimation methods good for? They're really good for sampling, right? Because if you transform onto the unit interval, then you can sample uniformly, and then it's invertible. And so you can, it's a great way to sample from the underlying distribution and all of its complexity. And of course, that's what those transformations are originally designed for. So they're great for some purposes, but they are not good for anomaly detection, because you stretch and twist and transform the distances between points, and so that the things that were far apart maybe are now close together. And you potentially lose any sense of tails or low probability regions entirely. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think that's it. We went over our questions. There was a great talk. Thank you again for being here today. It was
my pleasure, and this I've really been enjoying this seminar series too. So I look forward to the next one.
Thank you very much for your nice words.